I'd like to welcome everybody here today to our, it's February already, our February talk from the Arctic Institute and our Arctic Speaker Series. And I'm really pleased to welcome today Dr. Julie Cruikshank. She's Professor Emeritus from the University of British Columbia, where she taught anthropology. She was also the McLean Chair in Canadian Studies from 2001 to 2003. Like myself, she had a stint in Alaska for a while, so we have some common ground there. For many years, Julie lived in the Yukon Territory, where she worked with Indigenous women recording life histories. She also worked out of our Kluane Lake Research Station off and on, and that's a nice connection as well. So Julie's published a number of books, which are very interesting, and I highly recommend, and especially her book, Do Glaciers Listen? It's really a great and interesting read. So I'm not going to go on much more than that. I'd just like to bring Julie up and welcome her here to the University of Calgary.
Thank you, Mary Beth. I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks for that. Thanks for the invitation, and I want to thank particularly Melanie, who made all the arrangements to bring me here, including walking me across campus today, because it's quite a while since I've been here, and I might not have been able to find the building. But I'm also here, really glad to be here because of what you just mentioned. I've been one of the beneficiaries of the hospitality of the Kluane Lake Research Station, which is administered by the Arctic Institute, for a number of years. And I don't think that the research I'm going to talk about today would actually have happened if I hadn't had the opportunity over the years to talk with different scientists there to get some sense of what kinds of things they were thinking about and working on. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about, my presentation is actually organized around a series of stories that come from a particular location, North America's far northwest. On the surface, these stories tell us a lot about the impact of glaciers on human imagination, but they also, I think, tell us a great deal about a number of other things, environmental histories of environmental change, colonial histories, which are quite troubled in this region sometimes, and attachment of First Nations people to place in this area. So I'll begin with a few words about the setting, and then I'll go on to talk a bit about the circumstances of my research. Then I'll talk about some of the stories, and I'll conclude by talking about some of their 21st century entanglements. We'll see how well I can do this. Oops, sorry, I'm not pressing too hard. First, this map, which you'll see a few times, but I should just say that schematically, the white represents glaciers. I'll come back and talk about some of these glaciers specifically. You can see that some of them have long lobes, and some of those ones with those long lobes are the glaciers that I'll be talking about, the surging glaciers. Surrounding that are the green is park. There are two parks in Canada, Kluane National Park and Tatshenshini-Alsac Provincial Park, and two parks in, might as well get my little pointer out here, two parks in Alaska, Wrangell St. Elias and Glacier Bay National Park, and they surround the glaciers, and I'll talk a little bit about the World Heritage Site later that this has become. This is a place that is conventionally deemed to be out of the way, distant, far away. In fact, an early visitor to this region, Jean-François de Lapérouse, who came in 1786 and actually landed here at Lituya Bay, when he arrived here, he said that he described in his journals his feeling that he was at what he called the verge of the world, which is colorful, but it's not particularly accurate even for the time that Lapérouse arrived, because by 1786, the Russians, the British, and the Spaniards were already very active with commercial, globalizing sea otter trade, sea fur trade. Those furs were heading off to Madrid, to Paris, to London, and to Moscow. So Lapérouse was actually here to try and get a piece of that for France. It wasn't as far as he suggests it was, away from everything else. And then the following century, it became the axis of the dispute between what was then known as Russian America, now Alaska, and British North America, now Canada. The treaty making the division was made in 1825, but it took another 90 years before surveyors could actually draw the boundary between our two nations. And I would think that most of us in this room would be challenged to be able to draw this without some cartographic assistance, because it follows mountaintops all the way down the edge. And it was very hard to actually survey. And there were huge debates between the US and Canada at that point about where that boundary should be and whether it should be there at all. And more recently, it's become the center for a lot of discussions about environmental history, partly because it's a site for high latitude, high altitude climate change research, particularly in here, in areas connected with the Arctic Institute's research station at the south end of Kluane Lake. And it's also the center of the world's first Transporter World Heritage Site, which again I'll come back to, taking in those 4 parks that I mentioned earlier. So yes, far and distant, but also quite central to contemporary debates. The circumstances of my research are really these. It was a strange way to get into this question about glaciers, because my presentation then sort of centered on it originates in a puzzle from my ethnographic research in the Yukon Territory. During the 1970s and 1980s, I lived in the Yukon, and I worked with a number of senior elder First Nation women who wanted to record life stories for younger people in their communities. What was surprising to me was that they wanted to record a lot of stories about glaciers, and this was a difficult thing for me to understand because they didn't actually live particularly near glaciers at that time. But the kinds of stories they talked about were glaciers that crossed rivers and dammed huge lakes that then burst out with catastrophic consequences. There were stories of people traveling from the coast to the interior, walking across glaciers, and other stories of people coming down rivers under bridges, glacier bridges that blocked actually all the major rivers from the Copper River right down to the Stikine at some point in the last few hundred years. There were stories about colorless people coming over the colorless glaciers, the white people who came who themselves had no color, and the kinds of transformations that their arrival heralded. So all these things were important for women to record in their stories. Mrs. Kitty Smith was one of the women who talked a lot about this. And initially, as I said, I was really surprised. Mrs. Smith lived in Whitehorse, 200 kilometers east of the glaciers, where they are now. But these were really quite central to her particular concerns. Mrs. Annie Ned, 4 years younger. Mrs. Smith was born about 1890. Mrs. Ned was born about 1894. Mrs. Smith never let Mrs. Ned forget that she was 4 years younger when they were talking about these issues. She also lived quite close to Whitehorse, but had grown up closer to the Tachinchini River area. But what basically, really, in both cases, the stories these women told led me to some literature. I really knew not where to go with these stories, and I probably wouldn't have followed them up if I hadn't had the opportunity to talk with some scientists and also to look at the literature on environmental change, historical environmental change in this region. And secondly, colonial histories of human encounters, which were sort of at the center of my ethnographic research. And third, I became very interested as things went along in the contemporary debates about local knowledge and the contributions that it can make to contemporary environmental sciences. So that I would want to argue here that these 3 things I think are relevant to understanding the past in this area, but they're also extremely relevant to understanding some of the issues that are very current in communities now in the Yukon and in Alaska. So back to our map. First, then the glacier stories that these women talked about some of them concerned environmental change. That changes that occurred in this area during the lifetime of their parents and grandparents. Scientists refer to a period that they call the Little Ice Age, which is roughly 1550 to 1850 are the dates that are usually given in the Pacific Northwest. The dates are slightly different. They're slightly earlier in Europe. And here they're slightly late. Oops, excuse me, wrong button there. They're slightly later because this area, Icy Bay, for instance, there are a number of accounts by scientists who were in here in 1900 who talked about the glaciers that were still expanding out of Icy Bay. It's now ice-free, although there are a number of bergs in it at different times of the year. But so I think the point I want to make is that these places looked where it was cooler, but places looked very different too, and there were surprising numbers of changes that were going on in these glaciers during the time that these women were children, and certainly during the times that their parents and grandparents, who were living over closer to the Alsek and Tachinchini rivers, were living in this region. I think that it's important to note, too, that these aren't just stories that come from oral tradition. They also turn up in all the historical accounts written by early visitors. John Muir's books are particularly interesting in this way. People who arrived here were electrified by, terrified by, overwhelmed by glaciers. They were so different from the kinds of things that people had seen before they'd come to this region. And Muir's accounts of glaciers, he used to talk about his glacier gospel, that was very central to his understanding of this place, are really quite interesting to read. So again, I think both the oral traditions and the written accounts both contain a lot of really close empirical observations, as well as a lot of really great scope for imagining what these glaciers meant in this place at this time. Then third, there are also these debates in the subarctic and Arctic right now about environmental knowledge and about the contributions of local knowledge to some of these larger debates. And I would use that term local knowledge to refer to, I think, what I call tacit knowledge that's part of everyday life, the kinds of things you need to know how just to live in the world at the time that you're living there. And of course, this kind of knowledge was absolutely central for visitors who came. There are stories throughout this area of people who tried, sorry, I'm definitely having trouble with this. People who tried to come in over the glaciers, heading toward the Klondike Gold Rush, for instance, and the glaciers that were littered with the debris when they were unable to make the crossings. People needed to know local knowledge that they could only get from local people. But I think even at that time, there were some very big changes happening with the way knowledge was transferred. Local visitors who came relied on local knowledge, but they very rapidly learned to distinguish between what they called practical knowledge and what they called superstition. And it's interesting to go through the accounts, too, where people will talk about Schwatka. If Frederick Schwatka, for instance, who traveled across a glacier in this region, talked about what a terrifying experience it was and how they couldn't have done it without Aboriginal guides. But then he talked about some of the superstitions that people had about the area, which of course were deemed to be less important. And I'll come back to some of those questions in terms of the stories these women tell. Over time, I think that local knowledge, the language that we use in English to discuss this has changed in many ways from primitive superstition. You don't hear those terms anymore, but you sometimes hear the terms ancestral wisdom or spiritual understandings, or more recently, indigenous science. And I think it's interesting to track this kind of language and how it moves through time, because very often I think it was used by visitors as the kind of foil for Western science, to try and to compare Western science with these other kinds of ideas. And in many ways, I think now that we're talking about indigenous knowledge or indigenous science, this can be seen as progress in some ways, but I think that there are ways that it still often presents local knowledge as a kind of object for science in many ways, something that scientists or others can learn from, but as a kind of data, rather than as a way that you might be able to learn about the world. The idea that it's an object that if we can collect the oral knowledge, it will somehow give us data that can be used in scientific models. And I think that sometimes creates some difficulties. Arguably, I would say local knowledge isn't something static, waiting to be discovered by curious, diligent outsiders. It's something that sort of is made in contact with people over time, so that, for instance, early indigenous knowledge, people talk a lot about what the local coastal people learned from interior people and what interior people learned from coastal people. And then again, when explorers came across the glaciers, there was a lot of exchange of knowledge there. And now I think what you're seeing is a lot of exchange of knowledge between scientists, park managers in this area, anthropologists, archaeologists, and others happening in communities with First Nations. What I really find right now, the even increasing discussions between Indigenous peoples about their discussions with people, other Indigenous peoples in the global north, the circumpolar north, or in the global south. So these are debates that are changing and developing all the time, and people continue to learn from one another in these discussions. So I'll just say a few more words about the physical dimensions of this place. These mountains, the St. Elias Mountains, which support these glaciers are some of the highest in the world, and I'm sure people here know that. They were created by ice ages, they've been maintained by climate, and they've been in place for thousands of years. And now, of course, they're melting. This region fascinates me for several reasons. First, because of the stories that I heard from these women who were so insistent that they were an important part of human history of this region. Secondly, because there's a sustained history of science here in this region now. The Arctic Institute has had this station at Kluane. It celebrated its 50th anniversary very recently, and a lot of the climatological research going on in this part of the world is actually supported by the supported by the research station that is run by the Arctic Institute. And third, this region again has become this very large part of this very large Trans-Border World Heritage Site, which I think is also will lead to some other questions as we go further here. So my general sense is then that this was once a site of commercial center for expanding global trade, and now it tends to be a site more for environmental narratives in different ways. And we may see this changing with the oil and gas developing as well, although various people who've talked about this say that it's sometimes when certain areas are under threat that the environmental connection becomes stronger. Guides who've talked about doing river trips in this region say that there were never as many people on these rivers traveling as when there was a threat of the Windy Craigie mine in this that was deemed to be coming into this region some years ago. So significantly, these glaciers include what some scientists call surging glaciers. And so the Steele, the Donjek, the Kaskawalsh is not a surging glacier, but the Lowell and the Tweedsmuir are all interesting. I'll show you, I want to just divert your attention here. The Alsek River and the Tachinchini River run by these glaciers, and you can see that they run quite close to them in some cases. So there are a number, what I'm going to do, I'll show you some slides of the actual glaciers, but it's important to know that the Lowell, the next one I show you, actually comes right to the edge of the Alsek River, and the Tweedsmuir also comes to the edge of the Alsek River. This one story from the Lowell Glacier that this is a slide, by the way, that I took maybe 1990, and I would say that the glacier is back. This is certainly very, very visible at the front of the glacier, so it's melting quite quickly. One story from Aboriginal oral history concerns this glacier, which people call Nahludi, or fish stop, because it stopped a migration of salmon up that Alsek River. I'm going to go back just for a second to show you that there's the Kathleen Lake here has got landlocked salmon in it, but there used to be at one point a migration up, right there, it's Kathleen Lake, up the river, and then so fish stop is the name that people use. And when they talk about what caused the glaciers, the elderly women all told the same story. They said that a party of Tlingit people from the coastal people, were coming in on a trading expedition, and among them was a 10-year-old or 10 or 11-year-old boy who probably hadn't been schooled properly, who made fun of a balding shaman he encountered by comparing his head to a glacier, a knobby glacier. And that, they said, caused the problem. The shaman was insulted, and he came and sat up this mountain, which is right across from, that's the Low Glacier coming toward it, and he began to dream, and he called the glacier across until it reached the edge of this promontory right here, where this gentleman, Jack Schick, is sitting, until it built up a wall, and it built and built and built the wall, and a great lake grew up behind, and then eventually there was an outburst flood, and people died downriver. And there are oral traditions of that happening at the confluence of the Tachinchini and Alsek that were probably some of the earliest documentation of the latest, the 1850s flood that happened. It's happened several times before that, but people still on the coast still remember this. Scientists talk about the same thing. Here you have, but they have a different kind of causality, of course. So here's the Lowell Glacier, and here's the lake, which is about 100 kilometers long. For those of you who know the Alaska Highway, this is it here. So large parts of the Alaska Highway would have been covered with water, and you can still see those beach ridges, especially near Haines Junction. It built up. Scientists talk about the tunneling. Eventually, the pressure on this dam eventually caused tunneling, and there was ultimately a catastrophic flood, which some geophysicists say probably emptied this lake in a couple of days. So the impact, you can imagine, it was a huge lake, and the impact is phenomenal. You can see it here. If you look at this, it looks rather like those little lines you see by the shore when waves come in and then go out, the little ridges. It looks sort of like little wave-caused things. But if you're walking through here, you are going up and down and up and down each of those hills. It's quite an amazing thing to see them. These were very common in the state of Washington, many other places, but usually they get turned into gravel pits because they have such good gravel. And so this, being in a park now, is exactly preserved in the form that it was. And the latest outburst was about 1850, but scientists think that it's probably happened 4 or 5 times in the last 2,800 years. John Clegg's done a lot of work at this at Simon Fraser University. So just go ahead here a little bit. More recently, I think it's just interesting to see I think I'll go back to the map if you don't mind just for a second, just to show you this exactly. I'm now going to look at this Tweedsmuir down at the bottom, this glacier here. This glacier started to surge. I've heard about surging glaciers. I've heard people talk about them. You don't really see them because they're in the distance. But in 2007, this one began to surge. And Chris Larson at the Geophysical Institute of I'll go forward again here. At University of Alaska, had time-lapse photographs put up here and took a number of photographs of it. It was coming very, very close. This is the Alsac River. And I've been in this area a number of times, and the glaciers were there, but they were sort of in the background. This summer when you were here, it was just sounded like explosions or sounds of gunshots. The cracking was phenomenal. I had a chance to go in. There was a group coming down the river, and they had to be helicoptered over this area because of potential dangers. So it was quite interesting to actually hear it as well as to see it. It came closer, closer, closer to the river, but it didn't actually cross. It just came up to the edge. But just to give you some sense, it's an enormous glacier. And as somebody said, you could drop a fleet of buses in here and never find them. The size is phenomenal. And you get the sense of people living here in this for long periods of time, and then this suddenly happening from nowhere, these glaciers coming. This was probably a pretty common experience in the Icefield Ranges mountains for sure. So I think one of the differences, rather than dwelling on the different kinds of stories, I think that for me the biggest difference between the stories the scientists tell and the stories Aboriginal people tell are that Aboriginal people merge these notions of nature and culture that we so neatly divide in our sort of, if you want to call it, Western way of understanding science or history or anything else. The story that I told was about how a young boy or somebody caused it. If something happened, somebody caused it. So the young boy caused the surge by speaking inappropriately or irreverently in front of somebody he shouldn't have. So it's this notion of nature and culture not being separated in the same way that we often take for granted. Whereas scientists, correctly in terms of what they're doing, so climate scientists talk about the absolute need to disentangle anthropogenic from natural factors if you're going to understand what's going on with climate change. So you can see that these are both very clear ways of understanding how things work. For scientists, you have to make this distinction between what humans are causing. We hear this all the time with climate change, and what's a natural cycle. But that's a distinction that we all make that is not one that is made by the people who lived here originally and in the kinds of narrations that they have about this place. Elders focus on the exchanges between humans and glaciers. And one of the ones, and again, this was just a complete puzzle for me. I had no sense of what was going on with this. I should show you one more slide to show you, talking about hubris, my own hubris. In the 1970s, when I was here, I was hiking in that area, and I discovered this cave. I was with other people, and we went in, and this is not a particularly good picture of it, but it depicts my hubris of going into that cave, because when I came back to show somebody the cave some months later, it was completely collapsed, of course. And the older women with whom I showed this photograph to were not particularly impressed at all. But what they told me, they began to talk immediately when they discovered I was one of the people, like so many young people at that point, who were hiking in the mountains and near the glaciers, was that never, never, never should you ever should you ever fry food near glaciers. Food near glaciers should be boiled. It should never be fried. no grease should ever spill from the cooking pot. It was absolutely essential not to have that happen, because they would say, when I'd ask why, they'd look at me as though they couldn't understand my lack of understanding, but the implication was that either the glacier or a being in the glacier or the forces that were part of that whole process would be offended by this, and that anybody who knew anything would know that and understand that. And they talked about how concerned they were about people like me, hikers and others who were going into the glaciers and maybe cooking bacon for breakfast. They talked about scientists they really worried about, because they were pretty sure they were eating bacon for breakfast because they were taking a lot in with them. And I now find this in a lot of the old journals too. A guy named Edward Glave, who was there, talked about what his guides refusing to travel with him anymore when he was saying they had their bacon and bean breakfast, and no guides are going to go anywhere with somebody who's cooking bacon and bean into the glaciers, the people cooking bacon and bean breakfast. But these things turn up as the superstition in the old accounts. But recent scholarly work has really let me just I'll go ahead to one more slide here. Recent scholarly work has demonstrated that places that are really important ways of thinking about memory and remembering place. I've done a lot of place name works with people in the north who want to record particular names that are part of the places and tell the stories and record the songs, because being there gives you a sense of being in that place, and it reminds you of all these kinds of histories. I think in this area, where you've got very active, dynamic landscape, it actually also provides a way for talking about change, because the changing glaciers and the changing arrival of these people who came over, the colorless people who came in, there's a way in which those kinds of patterns, I think, really the surging glaciers become an important way of talking about the kinds of tremendous change that happened in the 1800s and the early 1900s in this region. I'll just say another image here is that this is another thing people talked about, was crossing glaciers on foot by snowshoes, which sounds, I think it's pretty dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. But if you see, this is the Kaskawalsh, which is not a surging glacier. And it's a pretty stable glacier, and people do ski in there a whole lot. But you can, people refer to them as highways. And when you look at that slide, you can see why it would be a highway. It didn't make sense to me until I actually saw some of the photos in this region, because none of us actually get these close to these glaciers. So what I want to do now is talk about some new stories, and this one has a place in the first one. Some old stories we've talked about. Now we'll move to some very recent ones that have a little bit to do with melting and climate change, or something along that line. In 1990, someone who many of you know, David Hick, who is a scientist who was working at the Kluane Base Camp, and some of his students who were doing the pica work at that point, but they took a trip in the interior. They skied up this glacier right into the interior. To the central ice fields. And when they got there, they found, just as they were passing, they saw a rock that was about this high, and over it was draped a piece of moose hide that they said was about 1 meter long, 1/2 meter wide, roughly. It had holes in it, made by obviously human, and there was some sort of a fragment of thong through this. David knew what he had to do. He had to turn this, it was in the park, he had to turn it over to Parks Canada. For whatever reason, that meant it went to Winnipeg, where it stayed in a freezer for a long time. And local people speculate it was because Parks was pretty concerned about land claims discussions going on at that time. But when it came back, people were quite excited about this. The Parks officials were very interested, because this area has one of the largest grizzly bear populations in North America. And they thought that this, it was dated, when it was finally dated, it was dated at 1150 BP plus or minus 50 years. So more than 1,000 years old. It's quite amazing, because as David said, if they had come along maybe a day later or half an hour later, easily an animal could have taken it and just moved off with it. But things were beginning to appear from these mountains, and some are found, and of course some aren't. But this was tremendously interesting to local people, to think that they had an ancestor who had been in the central ice fields 1,000 years ago, and generated a lot of discussion at that time. But in the end, they couldn't do much more than date it. They couldn't do the genetic work, because it had obviously frozen, they said, frozen and thawed too often. Probably it had been there for a little while, and the thawing and the freezing meant that they couldn't gain any genetic material from it. Well, 6 years later, some hunters were, again, this is about where that was found, somewhere in here up above the K, but in the central ice fields. Now we'll move over to here, outside the park. There's a mountain here, just to the left of Kusawa Lake. So 7 years later, 1997, I think it was, a wildlife biologist and a couple of friends were in there hunting in that area. And they came across what the biologist described was caribou droppings the size of several football fields. It was just an enormous area of caribou dung. Here we go. Here's a picture of some of the biologists. They immediately contacted the First Nation and the wildlife branch and immediately began to see what they could see. I'm sorry I don't have a photo of this, but if you could look downhill behind me, that was the greenest grass I have ever seen in the Yukon. It was possibly the best fertilized grass that the Yukon has ever had. But it was amazing. Not only were the caribou droppings there, but artifacts were melting out of the glacier at quite a rate. They were, let's see, yeah, what the caribou biologists were interested in was the prehistoric, the idea that there could be, they could learn something about prehistoric caribou in this area. Biologists knew that caribou had been very common in this area until about 1900, and for some reason that no one has quite been able to explain yet, I don't think, certainly not at that point, the caribou more or less moved away about 1900. Could have been related to gold rush, whatever. It's hard to know, but this is a perfect spot for caribou to have been because it's up high. You're away from mosquitoes. They can come there. But what they also found were tools. And this young woman is the granddaughter of Mrs. Ned, the second lady I showed you, picking up. We went in there. Some of the people from the First Nation went in with the biologists, and she picked that up and then very quickly put it into a plastic bag, knowing that no archaeologist would want her to be handling it directly. But Diane later became the chief of her First Nation and has been very, very strong in directing some of the research on that's been going on about human heritage during these times. She's now the director of the new Parks and First Nation headquarters, which is joined in Haines Junction. It opened last spring, but they're now conjoined together. It had a fragment of a fragment of feather attached to it, and some other biological materials as well. Ultimately, many tools were found, and some of them go back to, some of them are as old as 8,000 years, which is just absolutely amazing. I'm sure many of you know more about this than I do if you're archaeologists, but it was an extraordinary discovery for the biologists, but also for the archaeologists who were interested in what could be learned from this. It gave people, certainly gave people in the First Nation a stronger sense of being able to buy into a particular historical project. And at that time, First Nation, Champagne-Ajac First Nation set up camps in the summer for students to, this is Caribou Thundlut Mountain. The kids called it Caribou Poop Mountain. And a number of the scientists, including scientists from the Kluane Base Camp, spent time, Peter Johnson, I know, spent quite a bit of time here working with the students so they could understand some of the kinds of things that were happening. This has been a really incredibly interesting project, linking scientists and people in the community in ways that they were not really linked before. Even more spectacular was a couple of years after that when there was an accidental discovery again by hunters in this region, which is, if I could show you, I'll show you on the map when we come back to the map later, but it was an area near a glacier called Samuel Glacier on the edge of the St. Elias Mountains, where a young man, possibly 18 to 20, maybe crossing one of those glacier highways, possibly caught in a storm, nobody can really know what, but he died there at that time. Just by chance, I heard the First Nation give a presentation just a few years afterward, and they showed this slide and the slide afterward. There is no snow anywhere, no ice anywhere, just a very few years. You would never recognize these as the same place. But the young man was wearing this hat, which is a beautifully preserved hat, obviously made by Tlingit women on the coast. So lots of people in the Yukon talk about which Tlingit grandmother might have made this hat. People think they might have known whose family it might have come from. He was also wearing a ground squirrel, or what people call a gopher skin robe, which wasn't as preserved as well from the interior. But there was a lot of material, DNA material, that could be retrieved from this. And again, people would talk about the grandmother who might have made this. A number of young women in the Yukon have started having workshops making squirrel skin robes again, and this has really had a huge impact on the community, I think, too. From the outset, there was close cooperation between the First Nation, Champagne-Ajac First Nation, and the scientists. and the work couldn't have proceeded otherwise, which is very different from maybe even 20 years earlier. This was on their traditional territories. Everybody agreed they should be participants. The BC Provincial Museum became involved in this particular project. The First Nation allowed the materials to go to the BC Provincial Museum for study for 1 year, and then it was renewed for a second year. There were Aboriginal people on the management committee as well as scientists. Eventually, the robe was dated initially at 550 years old, and then a second dating, which is now deemed to be more accurate, was only 150 years old. Younger people in the community were particularly excited by that because they said it puts it within the range of our oral traditions. So there's been a tremendous amount of work done with that too. I think just on this whole notion of crossing glaciers and so on, I think maybe just a second, I might have one more thing to say about this. Well, yes, I do. I'll come back to this. This picture really is fascinating to me because La Perouse, whom I mentioned at the beginning, who came to the coast in 1786, had an artist on board. And that artist drew this picture. And this man is wearing clothing that could only have been made in the Yukon Territory. It looks exactly like the pictures that were drawn in 1848 by the various trading post managers who were looking at Athabascan clothing. Everyone else is wearing kind of furs. They would have been furs received in trade from the coast, but this must have been a voyager. The only way he could ever have got there is by crossing glaciers. It's hard to know what route it could have been when you look at those mountains and when you look at the glaciers, but it does give a sense that people were traveling back and forth, and again, this photo has become important in oral history studies that people are doing. So again, this piece of bear skin presents scientists with the possibility, that they found in Kluane, presents scientists with the possibility of learning about ancient populations of grizzly bears and what they might have been like, but for local people, it's all about having an early ancestor. The tools that have come out of that high mountain hill Thuntlat are extremely interesting to archaeologists, but they also give a sense that there really was a strong connection between humans and hunters of caribou for a very long period of time in this region, way longer than anybody could ever have imagined before that, 8,000 years at least, right up until 1900, when something happened that isn't entirely clear. Melting glaciers, again, are revealing material evidence to scientists, but they're also reinvigorating the longstanding oral traditions in this area. And I have to say to Karen that this is, the best document of all of this research, of what's found, has turned up in the Journal of Arctic. Karen's, you've been publishing those articles. I think it's an amazing record to read. If anybody's interested in this, the scientific parts of each of these discoveries, that's where you can go and find those works. And I really think you're to be congratulated, and you are in the communities for doing that work too. There's a publication that's going to be coming out with the BC Provincial Museum at some point, authored by scientists and First Nations. It's a large publication, but it's been stopped because of funding things so far. So the work that really is available, I think, is very much available in Arctic. So just to move on, for local people know and talk a lot about climate change now. They might not have before, and they might not everybody is convinced, but they know, they have a history of knowing that there were all these changes. And I show you this photo and the next one just to indicate something that most people would see. The Alsek River, which I showed you earlier, is down here. It's just passing in front of here. This was a photo taken in 1915 by one of the people who was one of the boundary surveyors. He describes that wall of ice as, the wall is described sometimes as being 100 feet high. Measurements vary, but it's a serious wall of ice. And that would be in 1915. And the next photograph I'm going to show you is taken right in here in 2006. The glacier is almost gone. I'm going to go back to that last one just to show you. So the ice, all this ice, and local people know this. They can see this. They've heard the stories and they've seen this happen. This is where some of these women you saw at the beginning. They'd spent time in this area for sure. Mrs. Smith, the first lady you saw, had gone down this river right to the coast, was a child. So that other little photo is right in here. It just gives you a sense. Now, I took that in 2006. We were there last summer again, and you can't even get into that bay. It's so clogged with ice. The only way was to take a route way around through a very, very, very shallow river stream to get around this big lake that's in the middle, called Lake Alsac. It's different from Neoglacial Lake Alsac. This is now called Glacial Lake Alsac. But things are changing, and they're so fast from one year to the next, they're not recognizable when people get there the next year. And here's another example of, I spent some time at camp of Gary Clark, who was doing work on a surging glacier for about 40 years called the Tweedsmuir Glacier, right in the central St. Elias Mountains. And he was taking down the camp, so what do? You bring your family when to do the work. So we all went in, and a couple of scientists came as well to sort of take everything down to make the whole camp, which had been used for 40 years, but tidied up each year, completely invisible. That was certainly required by the park. The day we got in there, Gary looked at this and he said, "That funny little horseshoe I have not seen before. There's something funny going on there." So every morning we'd get up and we'd look at it, and nothing happened. It just sat there. And then the day we were leaving, we were sitting there, and suddenly there was a great boom, and half the side of the mountain fell down. It was just the most shocking thing I've ever seen. However, the scientists are looking for where we would go if it came over the next range, and the naive anthropologist is taking photographs. It did come up, but it didn't come over enough to cause a problem, but it certainly could have, I think. And I took these photographs down again to Mrs. Marge Jackson, who's an elder who lives in Haines Junction, who's been very interested in all this work. She passed away just a year ago, but she looked at these photographs carefully. I thought she'd be interested in what it looked like. I knew she'd been in this country herself. She had one question: what are those guys cooking up there? End of story. And so, I think there's this very interesting thing that happens because there is the scientific research, what it does, and I think this is all really important. Scientists take observations from field sites and then they compare them with other field sites, and then they can turn these observations into universals. They are universal observations that contribute to universal. I'm not a scientist, so I'm hoping I'm speaking this way correctly, but to giving you some universal laws, making generalizations. But doing that will inevitably violate kind of local ideas about what these things are. So there is this tension, and I think for me the tension that's really interesting now is that scientists are, as they weren't in the past, really trying very hard to work closely with the communities, bit by bit. Mary Beth and I were talking about this earlier, and I think that that's happening more and more, but it needs to happen a great deal more because there's interest on both sides. And it used to be scientists would say, I know geophysicists would say to me, well, we deal with 10,000 year periods. It doesn't really have much to do with local knowledge, but it does have to do with the fact that these are local territories. So I think that there have been some very interesting changes in the last little while in that score. Finally, I'll just be winding up shortly here. The other thing I have to say that's I think interesting, and it's the answer to my puzzle, one of the reasons why are these women telling these stories. During the 1940s, as you know, the Second World War came along, and Alaska was very concerned, well, America was very concerned, I think, about the fact there might be an invasion from Japan in Alaska. So it was decided to build a highway down this route to connect Alaska with the motherland. It was done very rapidly in 1942-43. There were some 34,000 people were involved in the construction of the highway, which is a magnificent engineering feat. However, the request was made of the commissioner in the Yukon to would it be possible to let the surveyors and the soldiers who were working there hunt on their days off, and that was granted by then Commissioner Jekyll. What happened, as local people say now, is that people would go out and hunt, then they would forget, they would have to go back to get some help to take out a moose if they'd found to drag it out, and then they wouldn't be able to find the moose again. So there was a great deal of wastage of meat, and that's one of the things people remember most, local people, about the construction of the Alaska Highway. Following the construction, there was a commission set up to investigate, and it was deemed by the federal government that this was indeed, this had indeed been caused by overhunting by people who've been visitors, but that the only conclusion was to turn this into a protected site. This was before it became a park, in which nobody could hunt. So the indigenous people who had hunted in that area were moved outside to new communities like Haines Junction and Burwash Landing. And you got this remarkable situation where somebody who hunted on the east side of the highway would be deemed to be a good provider, and an indigenous man who hunted on the west side of the highway in the park or in the sanctuary, as it then was subject to prosecution. And in fact, a number of men went to jail for hunting. So this was a very difficult time for a lot of people. And subsequently, there's been a land claim settlement. There was a special hearing in Burwash Landing to discuss specifically this whole situation of people being moved out. I mean, I remember when I first went to Burwash Landing in 1973, and there was an elder there, Jimmy Joe, who was sitting on his porch with field glasses watching the helicopters from the research station flying in and out of the mountains. But he himself couldn't go in to hunt. And it was very fraught. The relationships between that community and the scientists have improved dramatically, but it was a very vivid memory from that point. And certainly it's been, it's quite an issue. But what you get here is really, you get this area that used to be sort of an area where people all lived together. It's crisscrossed by boundaries, the US-Canadian border, BC, Yukon, boundaries around the park that either keep territories in or keep territories out, boundary keeping BC and Yukon people apart. It's a complicated, it's changed people's lives tremendously in terms of where they can hunt, where they can travel, where they can go, and that's all being resolved in the case of, with land claims. So I guess one of the things that, actually I think I'm just going to wind up now because we're getting a little later. So in this place, in this place, I think the thing that impresses me most is the fact that people here, the local people, really don't make this clear distinction between nature and culture when they talk about historical events. These things are connected. The natural phenomena and the and humans are quite connected, including glaciers and humans. Everything's connected. Whereas I think our thinking is changing as well. You know, we used to talk about natural disasters not so long ago in the lives of my contemporaries, at any rate, and now we don't think of things quite in that way. For instance, the New Orleans or the Haiti or the earthquake in China. There's a connection. So-called natural disasters often are now deemed to have a human component, and so I think that these are interesting kinds of connections that are being made in our larger world as well. But still, I think these stories are often hard to think with. And if I think that the fundamental question for me is how the relationships, how we all in the world grow into the world, and we learn about how we learn about what we think objects and things and humans and animals are in the world, and we learn what we think those divisions are or aren't. And there is a real difference in the way people raised in this country here think about those things, I think. So we may go further with that in questions if you're interested. But just to conclude, I think that successive versions of the St. Elias Mountains they're always recast to serve present purposes. All the stories by everybody. The stories are always about now in a way. Even the stories from the past, they make particular points. And in the Gulf of Alaska, where European and indigenous internationalism had gone on for a long time, these were international movements between the Tlingit people on the coast and the Athabascan peoples in the interior. These things, places and people have always been entangled. They've always been tangled up very much. And I think in the future they're going to be even more entangled in the lives that the rest of us will see. Local knowledge in Northern narratives is really about the unique entanglements between nature and culture, humans and landscapes, objects and their makers. So material evidence of human history from the lost man, Kwadisan Sinche, who was found, or those caribou pellets, or the modified bear hide can be naturalized as probable genetic evidence of natural history. But memories that are layered under these appliqued boundaries and borders and parks and so on, I think, are also particularly being re-energized by this contemporary human history. The glacier stories I heard years ago may originate in the past, but they're really very much about the present, I think. And they'll likely continue to have very entangled social lives in this place. So thank you very much. If anyone has questions, I'm asked to pass the mic. Just
No,
for,
I can be the mic passer.
okay. Just this is so it'll be recorded rather than to be heard.
Julie, do you know of any scientists, particularly, let's say, physical scientists, who have taken to heart any of the customary beliefs in their treatment of the land or the things that they're studying? And has it made any difference into their research and their, I don't know, experience?
This is just, again, my personal comment. I would say that in general, the scientists I know have really been interested in talking with local people for even during the 80s and 90s, a lot. But I can think of one example where a scientist biologist was extremely interested in talking with an elder, Mrs. Ned, the second lady you saw. But when she began he wanted to find out why the caribou if she knew. She remembered caribou hunting when she was a child. But he wanted to know what she knew about this, and she insisted that there was a story that he had to listen to. And he was terrific. I mean, he was interesting and really listened, but he had to get back. He had to watch his wife. He had to be back at the office before 5, and this wasn't the kind of information that he could use in his models. So I would say he was like me. When I first heard Glacier stories, I didn't really, I mean, he wanted to know, but I can't say that he was able at that point to take it into the work. Now, what I hear all the time from younger scientists is, and I've talked to a lot of young geophysicists who are, in their 20s and 30s, who are really truly interested in this, and whether it affects the way they do their research, or I think it affects the way they do their research. I think they really are very interested in making sure that local people know what they're doing, maybe even have somebody come into a camp from the community to see what they're doing. Whether it affects the models, I'm not sure, but I think it's become a debate anyway. I think that the way that it would affect things is really this whole question that we now, scientists talk now about anthropogenic causes of climate change all the time. So in a way, it's a similar story. They might.
But what if scientists not Friday?
Ah, there you've got it. Yes, yes. I cannot comment on this. No, because I have to say that when I was on the glacier, I did not eat bacon, but I cannot say that bacon was not cooked. I'm ashamed. Not for myself, but for them. But no, probably not quite that. But I wonder if it might. I don't know what might happen in the future. Yes.
I don't.
Oh.
First of all, thank you. Very exciting narrative in itself, and the way you weaved Gary Clark's work and subtlety into it is also elegant. I wonder. The question I ask myself is, what next?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a kind of a Silk Road there. We're talking about trade, and you know that there are disaster narratives, and in those narratives there is, key detail like the ice was here, and then it was there, and so many people died. And so there is the empirical fact that's revealed, and then there is the narrative. It happened because of this young man, insulting Jama, this person not wanting to share. Those narratives are occurring now because of anthropogenic influences.
Yes.
So there are new narratives being created, and they're being created in high latitude as you connected, high latitude and high altitude regions. So the question I ask myself is, what now, in the sense of there's a clear pattern, as there is in your area of research, as well as in Central Asia, of these types of narratives, because glacial bursts are occurring, and meaning is being created along with the science.
Yes.
And so, and that meaning is being co-created with the scientists because they're involved. So it's a different dimension of engagement. And so I wonder if your next project, I don't believe in retirement, is to actually sit and look at these narratives across these regions as as the new narratives arise.
I think that's a brilliant idea, and they are being made because people from these territories, from the Yukon, are now going to Greenland. They're going to Saha Republic. There are movements. I think that's a brilliant suggestion. I think it would be a very good idea for a younger person maybe to take this on. Yes. The other thing that's going on at the same time is that I must say that's interesting. Usually a question I'm asked is, well, that's all fine, but you're talking about older people. What about younger people? And I am really interested in the number of places in the Northwest Territories, in the Yukon, in these other places where there are summer camps being for younger people, and it includes university students, Aboriginal university students who are going to these camps to learn these things about how their elders talked about these issues. So there's some interesting kind of thing going on there too. And these students are often science students, I would add. And I'm really interested in how those students will take those stories into the science particularly. I would say that just as a result of that, the finds that were on Fundlat with the caribou droppings, there are a number of students who went onto University of Alaska, University of British Columbia, University of Victoria to study science as a result, I think, of those projects. I may be overstating the numbers. I'm not sure what they are. But I'm very interested in how those ideas are being brought into the sciences. And I see that now actually in some faculty members that I've met, especially Simon Fraser has faculty members who are Aboriginal who are talking in this way in archaeological discussions. So brilliant suggestion, and I'll think about it if I can think about another 20 years research. Thanks very much for the question. Anybody else? Yes.
What is being done to document the traditional knowledge versus just having it passed on
All right.
in oral?
Really good question. Oh, yes, I'll restate. Question is what's being done to document traditional knowledge now that it's maybe not being passed on so much in orally? Yes. I'll have to say that when I started this kind of research, and it was in the early 70s, and it wasn't even anything I planned to do particularly. I wasn't a graduate student. I'd gone to the Yukon for a little project, and this was suggested. So it was unusual. Well, at that point, all the young people I knew, sorry to do this history, but I think it's important. All the young people I knew were absolutely involved in the project of land claims, developing a land claims proposal that would eventually go forward to the government, and it took 20 years for them to do that. So their view is that somebody like me, an outsider, could very well do some useful work by documenting women's life stories. They pointed out the ethnographies have lots of things about men's hunting, very little about women. So I did a lot of documentation with the Yukon Native Language Center, which was established sort of during that period of time. Linguists began working. Aboriginal people became trained as linguistic workers as well. And that developed. Now, I went back to school in the mid-1980s because it was really clear at that point that there were younger people now getting ready to do this kind of work. And I would say that in every community, there is probably, since land claims was settled in the mid-1990s, there's a lot being done. With the remaining elders, people going back to the tapes, all the tapes that I recorded years ago are in the archives, so people can go back and listen to those with permission from the families whose grandmothers those were. I'd say it's very active right now. And unfortunately, it probably wasn't very active when these women who I worked with were younger. And so, but I think your question is really an important one too, because some of those traditions begin to change as well. And I've been hearing some of them, and I think that this is probably always what went on, that they were always stories about the present as well as about the past. So the stories are still being used to think about what's going on in different places at different times. I'd say lots. Thanks. Yes?
I have to make a confession as someone who actually cooked bacon on the
We'll forgive you.
Also provided by the Canadian Forces and the Arctic Institute at their high altitude research camp. So I'm concerned about what kind of impact of the years of the high altitude project with that canned bacon that was up on the mountain.
You may be forgiven in your next life. No. Oh, did you want to say any more about that, or no? It's okay. Yeah. Public confession. Now, you're somebody who's thought a lot about these issues too, tremendously about the oral traditions too. Yes. Well, any other questions at all? Otherwise, thank you very much for your patience and.